We begin with today's late-breaking news in the corruption trial of former Democratic Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich. After 14 days of deliberation, a jury of 6 men and 6 women found Blagojevich guilty today on one count of lying to federal agents. One count out of the 24 counts prosecutors had brought against the former governor.
This particular prosecutor did everything he could to target me and prosecute me, persecute me, put pressure on my family, try to take our home, take me away from our kids, arrest me in the early morning hours on December the 9th with Patty and me in our bedroom and our little Annie in bed with us, a sitting governor. And that very prosecutor said he was stopping a crime spree before it happened. This jury just showed you that notwithstanding the fact that the government threw everything but the kitchen sink at me, that on every count except for one and every charge except for one, they could not prove that I did anything wrong, that I did break any laws.
The judge has declared a mistrial in those other 23 charges. Prosecutors say they will retry Blagojevich and his co-defendant brother on the other, more serious charges, like the charge he tried to sell or trade President Obama's old Senate seat for a new job or campaign cash. This is a shocking conclusion in a case that everybody seemed to believe back in the day was cut and dried. In the early days of this political corruption scandal, everybody just knew he was guilty. It was ludicrous he was protesting his innocence. It was ludicrous that he was giving interviews in which he was protesting his innocence, which, of course, he did on this very show.
You are probably going to go to trial in an actual courtroom, a criminal trial on these. Will you defend yourself in that setting, or will you also mount no defense like you have in the Senate? Will you defend yourself in court?
Oh, no, absolutely. Are you kidding me? Absolutely. Yes.
Now, Rod Blagojevich never did take the stand in his own defense, in part because he was the person most roundly convicted in the court of public opinion before his trial since, I don't know, O.J. Simpson. He went from that guilty, corrupt governor guy to that deluded guy with the hair who denies he's guilty and goes on reality shows. Rod Blagojevich wasn't just presumed guilty, he was a laughingstock, a symbol of everything that is wrong in American politics. We heard the tapes, right, from the wiretaps, and they were comical in their bluntness. Speaking about the open Senate seat vacated by President Obama, Blagojevich made it clear that nothing for something just wasn't going to cut it. He wanted the White House to make him an offer.
And if they treat me without, any real, that they don't have any great interest in a Senate seat, they're not going to offer anything of any value, then I might just take it.
Senate seat was, Blagojevich said, something rather special, and it was his.
I mean, I've got this thing, and it's golden.
I still love that quote. In addition to the charge the former governor tried to sell a Senate seat to the highest bidder, prosecutors also allege that he tried to shake down the Tribune Company. His wife, Patty, can be heard in the background of one call, telling her husband to hold up the sale of Wrigley Field, home of the Chicago Cubs, my beloved Chicago Cubs, because of some bad press coverage the governor was receiving.
Totally hold up that Cubs.
Between the boldness of Blagojevich's demands and the salty language he was so fond of, it seemed clear at the time that he was up to really shady stuff. But was it illegal? Today, a jury said no, it was not. Well, that's not quite right. They couldn't agree that it was. I think in an atmosphere of assumed corruption, an atmosphere of low public trust in the institution of government, in which the distinction between criminal corruption and the baseline corruption with which government functions grows increasingly blurry, former Governor Blagojevich did all he could to make that distinction even fuzzier.
Even if you wanted food for the hungry, I mean, even if you wanted justice itself in exchange for the Senate seat, you're not supposed to exchange anything for the Senate seat.
Well, I don't disagree that one for the other isn't, but there are political negotiations and leveraging, which is all very much part of the process.
Political negotiations and leveraging, which is all very much part of the process. That was ultimately Blagojevich's defense, that it's all just politics, and in an atmosphere in which politicians routinely solicit money from wealthy people who want something from the government. Maybe that wasn't such a crazy, crazy notion after all. Blagojevich's ultimate defense seems to be that he was so bad at those, quote, political negotiations that his ineptitude was apparently exculpatory. Joining us now is Andy Shaw. He's the executive director of the Better Government Association, the former chief political reporter at WLS TV in Chicago, and my father-in-law. Andy, thanks so much for being here.
A pleasure being back with you, Chris. I kept thinking the next time I would get to talk to Rachel, but here you are.
I know, it is a disappointment. You can join the viewers in that. I guess you were actually at the trial for much of it.
Right.
The first question is, were you surprised by today's verdict, and do you get the sense that people in Chicago and Illinois are surprised?
I was surprised, and I think my conclusion after today is that there was a disconnect. Those of us who have followed these stories and this corruption for many years, and I've probably done 100 of these trials, understand the indictment, understand the burden to prove guilt, and seem to feel that the prosecution generally meets the burden, and they do 90% of the time. But this was a complicated case. There was no smoking gun. Rod Blagojevich never made the final phone calls for the quid pro quo, and maybe most important, none of his alleged transgressions actually resulted in a favorable outcome. He didn't sell the Senate seat. He didn't win legislative changes he wanted to. He didn't get the campaign cash he asked for. He was essentially a bumbling crook.
Well, but that's the interesting part. I mean, you said this to me. We were talking earlier about this. There were some cases, my understanding is there's some cases in which he hit people up essentially for what looked like these extortionary quid pro quo donations. They walked away and said, forget about it, and they still got contracts, or they still got the thing that was being held out as the quo. Is that right?
Right, and here's the trick here. The feds made it very clear that you don't have to succeed at your shakedown. You just have to try to do the shakedown. The jury apparently didn't buy that. And, you know, despite the fact that Rod and his attorney are already campaigning for the second jury, because this case will be retried, they're already basically blasting the feds for all of this. We don't know if it was 8-4 for conviction or 9-3. And, you know, this, at the very least, he perverted and subverted Illinois government. He disgraced his office, and he basically humiliated all of us in Illinois. Not a single juror would find him not guilty of those charges, but the bar of criminal conduct in a confusing and complicated case apparently was different for a group of jurors who have normal lives than it was for those of us who live in this world. And so at the end of the day, they were divided, more divided than we expected them to be. And the second trial figures to be even more interesting and perhaps more entertaining, and sadly more expensive than the first one, because we taxpayers in Illinois are going to pay for his defense in trial 2, and we, in the second most fiscally bankrupt state in the nation after California, are going to see another bill of $3, $4, or $5 million. No one is going to like that here in Illinois.
You say that because Blagojevich is actually tapped out, so he's probably going to have a public defender, a court-appointed lawyer at some point. I want to ask this question, though. What does this say about the prosecution of corruption? I mean, it's been a trend in Chicago, right? Illinois politics have been corrupt for a long time. Chicago politics is corrupt for a long time. When there is a breakup of that corruption, it tends to come from federal prosecutors coming in from the outside and kind of busting things up and busting things open. And if they can't do that here, what does that say about the future of governance in Illinois and in Chicago?
Well, that's a troubling outcome of today, but I want to remind you that Pat Fitzgerald's conviction record is 95% in these cases. He has suffered a setback today, that's true. But we have another Illinois governor, the second in a row and the fourth in the last 8, convicted of a felony, facing jail charges and a fine on lying to the FBI. So in a sense, he's not scot-free. He says he'll appeal that. But what it does say is that with the honest services provision that was tossed out by the Supreme Court, the bar in these corruption cases is a bit higher, and for whatever reason, the feds were unable to bring the jury above the bar. So does that mean that he's innocent as a hound's tooth, as he's claimed? Obviously not. Trial 2 could bring in Rahm Emanuel, Valerie Jarrett, Jesse Jackson Jr., Tony Resco, the fixer from the first case. And so it could be a very different case. I think the sad thing is it drags Illinois residents through a few more months of this muck, and it costs us a few million additional dollars.
It costs the residents of Illinois. It is probably good for cable news hosts, I will say. Andy Shaw, he's the executive director of the Better Government Association, the former chief political reporter at WLS-TV in Chicago, and my father-in-law. Andy, thanks so much for being here tonight. We will talk off the TV at some point soon.
Yeah, let me ask you one question. What do I tell all the other in-laws who want to know how they get on the show?
You give him my email address. How about that?
Okay, I'll do that.
See you, Andy.
See ya.